So this week is a bit of a week of endings, it seems. We're ending our look at John 6, even though that's obviously not the end of the Gospel of John. We're ending our time with Ephesians this week, and also with our stories of David and Solomon from 1st and 2nd Samuel and from 1st Kings. So maybe a time to sum up some of the things that we've heard and found in those readings over the weeks. But looking at this week, was there anything in particular that struck you, Karen?
Oh, yes. The bread of heaven. We've been chewing on that for quite a few weeks.
Yes.
And it's come in my reading, I've come across the notion of sometimes we bite off more than we can chew, or we might gag on our food. So there's some useful metaphors to play with. And if we remember what John is actually writing for, he's an evangelist, and he's writing for people to believe, and he's drawing people into closer and closer relationship with God so that they can be better community with one another. And so the invitation is to feast on Jesus. But what we read in this passage that we've had today is that there's people that just can't stomach it. It's too big an ask. And while they might have had a nibble and thought, oh, that's okay, and they've come along for a while, the whole banquet that Jesus offers, they just can't go there. And so we see that some of the disciples are falling away, and we're left with the 12. So that's one thing that comes to mind. And we sort of do that in our own faith, don't we? We put our toe in the water, so to speak, or we take a little nibble, and then we might jump in the shallow end and splash around for a while. And then we have to make a decision. Do we go on and commit ourselves and go swimming in the deeper water, or do we just stay splashing around? So John's Gospel, it actually is really deep if you sit with it a bit. I mean, you can splash around with it, but you can also swim with it, and it offers great riches. And it finishes with this language of abiding, and you'll be reminded of the vine imagery with God as the vine, and we abide in God. And so we have this lovely image of not only ingesting but being totally enmeshed, I guess, embraced in God's love. And I find that really helpful and encouraging images. So yeah, how did it strike you, Annette?
Well, yes, there's that reminder that this can be tough stuff to listen to, can't it? We didn't get to that little bit of John 6 last week. Some of it's a repetition, but that idea that it's not easy. But that is encouraging, isn't it? Because here we are, all these centuries later. It wasn't obviously so tough that everybody gave up and said, oh, no, this is all too much, we can't deal with this. That there've been faithful people who've kept dipping their toe in the water, having a little nibble here and finding something life-giving in it. And then coming to that place of abiding and passing it on then. So that, there's all these lovely images, and they're useful for bits and different pieces, aren't they? It sort of shifts. Like I think the us abiding in God is part of us then being responsible for passing things on to others. We're growing, and we're part of something as much as Jesus is part of us in that imagery of the bread and the wine. So bread and blood. So it shows how easy it is for us to make this about communion, and that little Freudian slip there, but it's not, is it? It's we need to sometimes really look at the text and what the words are saying and think about that, where that's not necessarily about communion. It's about our relationship with God, and with how Jesus is such an intimate part of that.
That's right. Like, John is alluding to the Holy Communion, but it's the sign of God's presence with us, that we can feast on Christ in that regard. Yeah. I like what you said about then teaching others, and it it leads us to that lovely piece in the Ephesians reading, where we can wear whatever shoes we need to proclaim the gospel.
Yes.
I do like the notion of putting on, sometimes it can be clothing. In this particular reading, it's some armory. But it's more than just about believing and having an intellectual assent to all that God is and God offers. Paul's, or whoever's writing Ephesians in Paul's name, is really wanting people to live it out in their everyday, every time engagements with everyone else. And so we are summing up Ephesians today, and we've got this lovely letter, and I would invite you to read the whole thing through if you've got time. But it's a letter encouraging that the whole of God's reconciling love in community, and it's a guide to help people be community, reconciled community in peace and love. And there's the breastplate of righteousness and the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, I think there was.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was something else as well, but it's not really the military armour that we might think of, because we get these shoes that can be whatever we need them to be. And, if we want to put the sandals of peace on, well, we can do that. And if we need to put on a garment of generosity, we can do that. And if we need to put on, the pants of patience, we can do that. So it's this lovely invitation to live out what it is that God is offering to us.
I do really like the pants of patience, and I like the idea that we can maybe pick up this imagery and run with it, and wonder what else there might be that we might come up with. But I thought too that this is something that I don't have a big history in Sunday school. I left Sunday school when I was 8 and didn't come back to the church when I was 20. But I know that this passage is one that often kids will be brought up the front, and they'll be putting on the armour. And so we kind of have a very concrete sense of the armour in this. But I'd like to think of it as what it's doing is actually flipping that idea of armour on its head, and that it's sort of saying, oh, okay, so you're going to put on armour for the battle, are you? Well, all right, you might be thinking about, putting on your breastplate to go out and fight in some way, but it's the breastplate of righteousness, and the emphasis, if we read it with the idea of what these qualities are, rather than sticking hard and fast to thinking in such concrete terms about the armour, then, that's another way of looking at it, and more helpful, I think, than thinking that we've got to go out there and battle every day. I mean, I have known people who would do that every morning when they got up and think about themselves, arming themselves for a battle as they go out into the world. And I like the idea of putting on those attitudes and those abilities, but with a more gracious way of dealing with what comes up in your day.
Yeah. So the one that we haven't quite found words for is faith. I don't know if it was a shield of faith, but it is. Faith is the way we live out our very day and our everyday, and not so much the things we must do, but the things we do out of love and generosity for people. People know when you're putting it on, when you're faking it.
Yeah.
And it talks about the spirit of truth in the John Gospel as well. Being real, knowing that we're loved by God, knowing that we're beloved. Yes. And sharing that love, freely and generously. I mean, that's what the invitation is. And if people are a bit prickly, they probably need more loving. I've probably said that before. It's a way of life that we're being invited into, and these writers back then got it, and we're still learning, and we're still catching on, and we're giving it our best shot. And none of us has the right to go judging anyone else who might still be just having a little sip to taste it and see, or hasn't even, beckoned the door of the church. We're the ones that are privileged to have learned about God's love and, rejoice in being community together. And, it's up to us to be sharing this good news and to be sharing God's love freely and generously. And it works.
Yeah, that's right. And it was one of the lovely things out of the John reading was that about you will come to believe. So the people in the story, the early Christians, it wasn't just Jesus was there and there was a blinding light about him. Even there, it was a process. It's a journey. That's right. And as you said, it works. Yeah. I did want to pick up something you'd said, though, about the John reading, and then we went off to Ephesians, but you talked.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. But I thought, that's a lovely segue into talking about the temple, and when you talked about the place where God is, and just what do you think that is being said there in that reading from First Kings?
Yes, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have this idea that in Hebrew scripture that God resided in the temple, but if we look closely at this 1 Kings reading, we see that, well, God's name's there, but God is beyond there, and there is a sense that God is for all people in this. So we might have been a bit harsh in the past, saying things like, Jesus supersedes the temple. Actually, God exists for all people. And while, we don't have to go to a temple to meet God, we've got Jesus. God meets people wherever they're at. And God is revealed in places. And, for Elijah, it was in the cave up on the mountain in the stillness. And for Moses, it was on the mountain in the burning bush. And, for you, it was somewhere else. And for me, it's somewhere else. And for all of us, we meet God in a place where God is. And that's where we are.
Yeah, that's right. And I loved from that reading, it's, as you said, the inclusiveness of it. It talks about even strangers coming and knowing that if they faced the temple, that they could address their prayers to God. And it's not saying only particular people can do this. It's open to everybody, isn't it? And that's such a generous kind of faith, and goes along with, we're very fond of quoting, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, but that for God so loved the world, it's for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's a generous love. I'm reminded of there's some people in South America that still farm in the indigenous ancient ways, and how they operate is that when someone's harvest's due, all the neighbours will go and help in with the harvest with no expectation, really. It's an act of giving. This needs to be done. And then, the next one needs to be doing their pruning, and they'll come and help. So it's always an act of giving. And, it takes them away from their own property, but there's this generosity of doing it all together. And, it's a sense that God keeps giving. And keeps giving to us, and we receive, and we're very grateful, but we're also the invitation is for us to live generously in that way. I think we could learn a lot from Indigenous peoples.
Yes.
I think they've transcended empire. They actually know how to be community together in a sustainable way, and we know that empire
of the land as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
I was just saying the empire of David, didn't, it crumbled in the end. So the way of Jesus, the way of giving is the way that we can all be sustained. And I think, in this time of pandemic and climate, it's code red now. the way we engage with Christ and act in a generous and giving, but also demanding justice. Yeah, I think Indigenous people can offer us a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, that idea of place, isn't it? And where God is, and where, you know, what we think of as the place where we encounter God, because we have to find the right balance somehow, don't we, between saying this is some kind of sacred space or place, and not holding on to that so tightly that we're saying this is the only place, or only particular people can encounter God here. And how we do that in terms of COVID times, where we've had to swap to different ways of worshipping, where people have wanted to be in their churches, and that's really important. But it's also been about the community, hasn't it? It's not just been about the place. But I wonder how we find that balance, because we certainly respect that in Australian Indigenous spirituality, the sacredness of place, but in our own tradition, how we say that without saying, but this is the only place that God can be.
Yeah. And yeah, and it's in community. We experience God in community, and being in, I'm still in isolation in Melton, and yeah, I'm placed, you know, in my home, which is all very lovely, but yeah, I miss community, and yeah.
And Zoom just doesn't cut it, does it? Once you've done it so many times, and
that's right. It's just not the same. Yeah, too many friends have been hugged when I've had the opportunity. Yeah. And yeah, I guess, you know, the invitation is to be open to, you know, God reveals God's self in surprising and unexpected ways too. And yeah, we don't need to pin it down to a particular building. It can be in our community on a picnic. I remember being on a guide camp, you know, when I was a teenager and having you know, this beautiful experience worshipping at the side of a lake. I'd never worshipped in the outdoors before, and it was remarkable. Yeah, it was, let God do what God will, and we're the better for it. Yeah.